May 2nd, 1944. 11:43 in the evening. In the depths of the Kremlin, beneath vaulted ceilings that have witnessed 3 centuries of Russian power, Joseph Stalin sits alone in his private study. A single lamp casts long shadows across maps of Europe that cover an oak table scarred with cigarette burns. The air hangs thick with tobacco smoke and the peculiar silence that surrounds absolute power. On his desk lies a decoded telegram from London, marked with the highest security classification the NKVD possesses. The message contains the exact date, location, and operational details of the largest amphibious invasion in human history, Operation Overlord, the Allied assault on Nazi-occupied France. The intelligence is perfect, the source is impeccable, the information is genuine, and Stalin, the man who trusts no one, is convinced it is an elaborate British deception. In the next 37 days, this disbelief will shape the greatest paradox of World War II, the moment when perfect intelligence became worthless because the recipient could not imagine his enemies telling him the truth. The spy's name was John Cairncross. History would later designate him the 5th man in the Cambridge Five, the most devastating espionage ring ever to penetrate British intelligence. But in the spring of 1944, he was simply a 31-year-old civil servant working in Hut 3 at Bletchley Park, the ultra-secret facility where Britain's finest minds were breaking German codes with a regularity that bordered on the miraculous. Cairncross possessed something more valuable than courage or ideology. He possessed access. Each day, he reviewed decoded German military communications, intelligence summaries prepared for Churchill himself, and strategic assessments that represented the accumulated secret knowledge of the Western Alliance. Each week, he photographed documents and passed them to his Soviet handler in London, and in late April 1944, he handed over intelligence so sensitive that its compromise could have meant the death of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. The documents revealed that Operation Overlord would commence in early June, that the primary landing zones were the beaches of Normandy, not the Pas de Calais, where German high command expected the blow to fall, that elaborate deception operations, fake armies, phantom radio traffic, doubled agents feeding false intelligence, were designed to keep German attention focused anywhere except northwestern France. Cairncross's intelligence laid bare the greatest secret of the war, the plan that Roosevelt, Churchill, Eisenhower, and Montgomery had guarded with obsessive security. The information reached Moscow Center, NKVD headquarters, within 72 hours. Analysts verified the source. The intelligence was graded highly reliable. It was translated, summarized, and delivered directly to Stalin's desk with urgent classification. And Stalin, reading it alone in his study that May evening, made a decision that reveals everything about trust, ideology, and the fatal certainty of the paranoid mind. He decided it was a lie. To understand this moment requires understanding the architecture of Stalin's worldview in 1944, a mental landscape shaped by decades of revolutionary conspiracy, brutal purges, and the unshakable conviction that capitalist powers fundamentally could not be trusted. Stalin had spent his entire political life believing in deception as the natural language of international relations. He had lied to allies, fabricated confessions, orchestrated show trials built on manufactured evidence. He had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, while planning, even then, for eventual confrontation. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, despite overwhelming intelligence warnings, Stalin initially refused to believe those reports too, a disbelief that cost the Red Army catastrophically in the war's opening weeks. By 1944, Stalin had learned to expect betrayal, but he had not learned to distinguish between genuine intelligence and deception. Instead, he had developed a more dangerous certainty that anything which seemed too valuable too precise, too complete, must necessarily be false. The British, in Stalin's calculation, were the supreme masters of strategic deception. He remembered their intervention in the Russian Civil War, supporting white armies against the Bolsheviks. He remembered Munich, the 1938 agreement that sacrificed Czechoslovakia to Hitler's ambitions, which Stalin interpreted as Western attempts to direct German aggression eastward. He believed, correctly, that Churchill would prefer to see Germany and Russia bleed each other white. And he understood that Britain's survival had depended on intelligence deception, on making Hitler believe lies about British strength when Britain stood nearly defenseless in 1940. This history created in Stalin's mind an unshakable conviction. When British intelligence appeared to hand over their most precious secrets, it could only mean those secrets were weapons designed to injure the receiver. The specific details in Cairncross's report actually reinforced Stalin's suspicion. The intelligence was too good. It identified specific beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. It named the Supreme Commander Eisenhower. It described the deception operations designed to make Hitler expect Calais. To Stalin's paranoid logic, this completeness proved fabrication. Real intelligence, in his experience, came in fragments, contradictions, pieces that required interpretation. This arrived fully formed, a complete picture. Therefore, Stalin reasoned, it was a picture painted deliberately to deceive. He concluded that the British were feeding false invasion plans through a Soviet spy they had identified but not arrested, using that channel to spread disinformation. The real invasion, Stalin decided, would come somewhere else. Perhaps Calais after all, or Norway, or perhaps there would be no invasion at all, merely a political agreement between the Western powers and Germany to join forces against the Soviet Union. This last fear haunted Stalin with the intensity of nightmare. Since 1941, Soviet forces had borne the overwhelming burden of fighting Nazi Germany. On the Eastern Front, millions had died in battles of unimaginable scale: Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad. Soviet commanders had begged for a second front in Western Europe to divide German forces, to relieve the crushing pressure on Red Army positions. The Allies had promised an invasion in 1942, then postponed it. Promised again for 1943, postponed again. Each delay cost Soviet lives by the hundreds of thousands. By 1944, Stalin suspected that these delays were not logistical necessities but deliberate strategy, that Churchill and Roosevelt were allowing Germany and Russia to destroy each other, planning to invade only when both were exhausted, ready to dictate terms to whoever remained standing. Through this lens, detailed D-Day plans look like bait for a trap that would never spring. Records from the Soviet archives, declassified decades later, reveal Stalin's handwritten notes on the intelligence reports from London. In the margins of the document containing Cairncross's information, Stalin wrote a single word in Russian: disinformation. He underlined it twice. He ordered NKVD analysts to prepare assessments assuming the intelligence was false, to identify what strategic goal the British hoped to achieve by planting this elaborate deception. Those assessments, preserved in Moscow's archives, concluded that Britain aimed to keep Soviet forces away from Eastern Europe, to make Stalin believe the Western Front would open so that he would not press his own offensive westward, or to trick Soviet intelligence into revealing its sources by acting on the information. Not one analysis considered that the intelligence might simply be true. Stalin's certainty had created institutional certainty. The possibility of truth had been excluded before investigation began. What makes this failure of belief even more remarkable is that Cairncross's intelligence was not Stalin's only source about D-Day preparations. In the spring of 1944, Soviet intelligence was operating multiple networks across Europe and Britain. An agent code named Hola working in the Abwehr, German military intelligence, had reported detecting massive Allied preparations in southern England. Sonia, a Soviet spy ring operating from Switzerland, had transmitted German assessments of Allied invasion capabilities. Soviet military attachés in London had observed the obvious, the accumulation of landing craft, the movement of American and British divisions to coastal staging areas, the intensification of air attacks on French transportation networks. Every intelligence source pointed toward the same conclusion: a massive invasion of France was imminent, and Normandy was the likely target. Yet each piece of confirming evidence somehow reinforced Stalin's disbelief rather than overcoming it. The very consistency of the intelligence seemed suspicious. Stalin told Vyacheslav Molotov, his foreign minister, that the British were showing us too much. When General Fyodor Kuznetsov, chief of Soviet military intelligence, presented a summary of multiple sources all confirming the Normandy invasion timeline, Stalin reportedly responded, "This is what they want us to believe. What are they hiding?" He ordered Kuznetsov to find the contradiction, the hidden truth beneath the surface agreement. Kuznetsov, terrified of Stalin's displeasure and remembering the fate of intelligence chiefs who had been executed for bringing unwelcome news, began emphasizing uncertainty in his reports, highlighting the smallest inconsistencies, suggesting that confidence in the intelligence might be premature. The entire Soviet intelligence apparatus began to mirror Stalin's skepticism. Not because the evidence demanded skepticism, but because Stalin's worldview demanded it. The supreme irony is that Stalin was partially correct about British deception, just not in the way he imagined. The British were indeed running the most elaborate strategic deception operation of the war. Operation Fortitude was a masterpiece of misdirection, using fake armies, double agents, false radio traffic, and dummy equipment to convince German intelligence that the invasion would strike at Calais, not Normandy. Inflatable tanks were positioned in Kent to simulate massed armor. General George Patton, whom Germans respected and feared, was placed in command of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, his headquarters generating radio signals that German listening posts dutifully recorded. Controlled German spies in Britain, turned by British intelligence and operated without their handlers' knowledge, sent reports to Berlin describing invasion preparations aimed at Calais. The deception was so successful that, even after D-Day commenced on June 6th, German commanders kept divisions in reserve near Calais for weeks, convinced the Normandy landings were a diversion before the real invasion. But Operation Fortitude was aimed at Germany, not the Soviet Union. The British were not feeding false information to Stalin. Through Cairncross, they did not know Cairncross was feeding anything to Stalin at all. The Cambridge spy ring remained undetected until 1951, when Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess defected to Moscow, initiating investigations that would eventually expose Cairncross. In 1944, British intelligence had no idea their D-Day secrets were reaching Stalin's desk. They were not playing a complex game of triple deception. They were simply planning an invasion and trying to hide those plans from Germany. That Stalin received genuine intelligence about those plans was an accident of espionage, not a stratagem of deception. Stalin's paranoia had created a phantom conspiracy that did not exist. The consequences of Stalin's disbelief were both tragic and, paradoxically, inconsequential. Tragic because Soviet forces, had Stalin trusted the intelligence, could have planned coordinated offensives to prevent German forces from shifting westward to reinforce Normandy. The Soviet High Command could have prepared Operation Bagration, the massive offensive in Belarus, to commence simultaneously with D-Day rather than 3 weeks later. Better coordination might have shortened the war, saved lives on all fronts, trapped German armies between simultaneous hammer blows east and west. Stalin's distrust meant that opportunity was lost. Soviet military planning in May 1944 proceeded as if the Western Allies might not invade at all, as if Soviet forces would continue bearing the primary burden alone. Yet the consequences were also inconsequential because the Allied invasion succeeded regardless of Soviet belief or action. On June 6, 1944, at 06:30 in the morning, the first waves of Allied soldiers hit the beaches of Normandy. The operation that Stalin had dismissed as British deception began with the roar of naval bombardment, the drone of aircraft, the ramps of landing craft dropping onto sand and stone. Within hours, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. Within days, the beachhead was secured. Within weeks, the liberation of France had begun. Stalin's disbelief had not altered reality. His paranoia had not prevented history. The invasion he thought was disinformation proved devastatingly real, and German forces in the West began the long collapse that would end in Berlin's ruins 11 months later. Records indicate the exact moment Stalin realized his error. On June 7th, one day after D-Day, Soviet intelligence delivered updated reports confirming that Allied forces had landed at Normandy, precisely as Cairncross's intelligence had specified. The landings matched the leaked plans in every particular: location, timing, force composition. That evening, Stalin called a meeting of the State Defense Committee. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who attended that meeting, later wrote in his memoirs that Stalin appeared unusually quiet and did not mention the intelligence failure directly. Instead, Stalin ordered immediate acceleration of Soviet offensive preparations, commanded that Operation Bagration be launched as soon as possible to support the Western invasion, and instructed that coordination with the Western Allies be increased. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply shifted to a new reality as if the previous certainty had never existed. This was Stalin's method: absolute conviction followed by absolute reversal, with no acknowledgement of the transition. What haunted Soviet intelligence officers in the aftermath was the recognition of how close they had come to being purged for telling the truth. General Kuznetsov, who had presented the D-Day intelligence, understood that if the invasion had somehow failed or been postponed again, Stalin would have blamed the intelligence services for accepting British deception. Officers would have been arrested, interrogated, executed for the crime of believing genuine intelligence. The paranoid system Stalin had created meant that intelligence officers faced death whether they believed truth or falsehood. If they believed lies, they failed in their duty. If they believed truth that seemed too convenient, they were suspected of being deceived or being deceivers themselves. The only safe position was absolute agreement with Stalin's interpretation, which made intelligence assessment pointless. John Cairncross, the spy whose intelligence had been dismissed, never knew during the war that his greatest coup had been disbelieved. He continued passing documents from Bletchley Park to Soviet handlers throughout 1944, providing intelligence on German military dispositions, weapons development, diplomatic communications. Each report was analyzed, verified, and utilized by Soviet intelligence, except for that one crucial assessment about D-Day. After the war, Cairncross left government service, worked as a journalist and translator, lived quietly until investigations in the 1960s identified him as a Soviet agent. He admitted espionage but was never prosecuted, partially because his activities were so far in the past, partially because public revelation would have required admitting the full extent of Soviet penetration of British intelligence. He died in 1995, aged 82, in a cottage in the south of France, still defending his wartime actions as anti-fascist duty rather than betrayal. The symbol that haunts this story is not a weapon or a map, but a piece of paper. The decoded telegram that sat on Stalin's desk that May evening in 1944. That document represented the pinnacle of espionage success. A spy in the enemy's most secret facility, transmitting the enemy's most crucial plans, delivered with perfect security to the highest level of Allied command. Everything the intelligence services existed to achieve had been achieved, and yet the document was worthless because the man who received it could not imagine enemies telling truth when deception was expected. The paper became a mirror reflecting Stalin's own worldview back at him. He saw in it not what was written, but what he believed must be written. A lie disguised as truth. A trap disguised as gift. Historians have debated whether Stalin's distrust of Western allies was justified by history or was paranoid delusion. The evidence supports both interpretations simultaneously, which is perhaps the deepest tragedy. Western powers did delay the Second Front, did have political objectives that conflicted with Soviet interests, did hope privately that Germany and Russia would weaken each other. Churchill did write of his desire to strangle Bolshevism in its cradle during the Russian Civil War. The suspicion Stalin harbored had roots in documented Western actions and stated Western aims. Yet this historical basis for distrust metastasized into something beyond rational caution. It became the inability to recognize truth even when truth served his interests, even when every indicator pointed toward truth, even when disbelief served no strategic purpose. The D-Day intelligence failure revealed a fundamental vulnerability in authoritarian systems. Dictatorships can compel obedience, can extract confessions, can enforce surface unanimity. But they cannot compel belief in inconvenient truths. They cannot create the conditions where subordinates risk contradicting the leader's certainty, where evidence can override ideology, where reality can penetrate the closed circle of power's assumptions. Stalin had created a system where only his interpretation mattered, where intelligence existed to confirm rather than inform, where analysts who challenged the leader's certainty faced not debate, but destruction. This system could win battles through ruthless application of force, could mobilize entire populations through terror and propaganda, could survive catastrophic defeats through sheer brutal endurance. But it could not process information that contradicted the dictator's worldview. It had made itself deliberately blind. What makes the story philosophically profound is that Stalin was betrayed not by his enemies, but by his own cognitive architecture. British intelligence did not deceive him, his assumptions deceived him. The information was perfect, his framework for interpreting information was catastrophically flawed. He had become so sophisticated in understanding deception that he could no longer recognize its absence. Every truth looked like elaborate falsehood. Every gift looked like concealed weapon. The mental habits that had perhaps kept him alive through decades of revolutionary conspiracy, through Stalin's rise to absolute power, through the purges where any sign of trust meant vulnerability, those same habits had become liabilities when confronting a situation where the enemy's incentives aligned with providing genuine information. The other spies in the Cambridge ring, Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, would later be celebrated in the Soviet Union as heroes of intelligence who had changed the course of history. Cairncross, whose D-Day intelligence should have been the crown jewel of Soviet espionage, remained lesser known, partially because his greatest intelligence success had been his greatest intelligence failure. The information he provided was too good, too complete, too valuable. It broke the believability scale. In the inverted logic of Stalin's paranoia, perfection proved deception. The spy had succeeded so completely that he had failed. In the decades after the war, as the full extent of Soviet espionage in the West was gradually revealed, Western intelligence services examined what the Soviets had known and when they had known it. The discovery that Stalin had received accurate D-Day intelligence and dismissed it became a case study in intelligence failure taught at agencies worldwide. The lesson extracted was not about better encryption or improved counterintelligence, though those matters received attention, but about the importance of leadership willing to receive information that contradicts expectations. Intelligence, analysts concluded, is worthless if decision-makers cannot imagine acting upon it. The most sophisticated collection methods mean nothing if the cognitive framework for assessment is broken. Perhaps the deepest irony is that Stalin's distrust of Western allies would be validated by post-war events, even as his specific suspicion about D-Day proved false. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany fractured almost immediately into the Cold War. The Soviet Union and Western powers did become enemies, did engage in decades of espionage and proxy wars and nuclear standoff. Churchill did give his Iron Curtain speech in 1946, describing Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe as a threat requiring containment. Stalin's worldview, that capitalist and communist systems could not coexist peacefully, that conflict was inevitable, that today's allies were tomorrow's enemies, was arguably confirmed by subsequent history. He was right about the long game, even when wrong about the specific moment. This makes the D-Day intelligence failure even more poignant. Stalin's correct assessment of fundamental Western-Soviet antagonism led him to incorrect conclusions about specific Western-Soviet cooperation against their common German enemy. The soldiers who landed on Normandy beaches on June 6th had no idea that their supreme commander's plans had reached Stalin's desk weeks earlier, or that those plans had been disbelieved, or that Soviet offensives that might have been coordinated with their landing were delayed by one man's. Paranoia. They knew only the immediate reality, the ramps dropping, the water deepening, the machine gun fire beginning, the slow, terrible advance up slopes of sand and stone toward concrete fortifications that seemed impregnable. They fought without knowing what Stalin believed or disbelieved. They died without knowing that their sacrifice had been predicted in intelligence reports filed in Moscow. The grand machinery of espionage and counter-espionage, of strategic deception and paranoid assessment, meant nothing to the individual soldier whose war consisted of the next 100 yards, the next hedgerow, the next French village. Yet their success vindicated the intelligence Stalin had dismissed. By nightfall on June 6th, Allied forces held the beaches. Within weeks, they had broken out of Normandy. Within months, Paris was liberated. The invasion that Stalin thought was British deception became the hammer that, combined with the Soviet anvil pressing from the east, crushed Nazi Germany between converging forces. Operation Bagration, launched on June 22nd, 3 weeks after D-Day, destroyed German Army Group Center, liberated Belarus, and opened the road to Berlin. The coordination Stalin's disbelief had prevented occurred anyway, slightly delayed, still effective. History absorbed his error and moved forward. In the end, Stalin's distrust of the D-Day intelligence reveals a truth more universal than World War II, more enduring than Cold War rivalries. It shows that the greatest barrier to understanding is not lack of information, but inability to accept information that contradicts our foundational beliefs. Stalin had constructed a worldview in which Western powers were fundamentally untrustworthy, in which apparent cooperation concealed betrayal, in which detailed intelligence was ipso facto deception. This worldview had experiential basis, historical roots, ideological justification. It was not crazy. It was not baseless. It was simply wrong in that specific instance. at that crucial moment. And being wrong meant that perfect intelligence became useless intelligence, that success of espionage became failure of analysis, that the truth reached the highest office in the Kremlin and died there, unbelieved, filed away as enemy deception. The spy told him the plans. The plans were real. The recipient could not imagine they were real. And so the greatest intelligence coup of the war became a footnote, a curiosity, a case study in how certainty blinds, how paranoia distorts, how the architecture of belief can transform truth into its opposite. On May 2nd, 1944, in that smoke-filled study in the Kremlin, Stalin read the truth and saw a lie. 1 month later, history proved him wrong. The beaches at Normandy ran red with blood and sacrifice, and the great liberation of Europe began, exactly as the dismissed intelligence had foretold. The spy had been right. Stalin had been wrong. And the war ground forward regardless, indifferent to who believed what, answering only to the terrible momentum of violence and courage and the slow, brutal progress toward victory.